forced to marry for land. He said, "This is duty." The Apache girl replied, "No love." But in the end, they found respect. The sun was just beginning to rise over the wide, dusty plains when he stepped out of the small wooden house that had been in his family for generations. The ranch stretched over a patch of land that had seen years of sweat, hard work, and quiet mornings like this one. Every fence, every tree, every corner of the property carried memories of his father and grandfather. But lately, those memories felt heavy. The land that had once seemed endless now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He had spent years trying to keep the ranch alive, but recent disputes over boundaries and rights with neighboring families had made him realize that alone, he might not succeed. He had always been a man of duty. Everything he did, every decision he made was guided by responsibility. Family, land, tradition, these were not just words to him, they were rules by which he lived. Love, he had long thought, was something that happened in stories or in people who had the luxury of time. His life had never allowed that luxury. And now, facing the threat of losing everything he had worked for, he found himself in a situation he could not ignore. The elders of the community had called him to a meeting the day before. Their faces were serious, their voices measured. They had discussed the possibility of a marriage, a union between him and a young Apache woman from a nearby family. It was not a marriage born out of love or desire, but a practical agreement to secure peace and protect the land. At first, he had resisted. He was not a man used to being told what to do, but the elders reminded him of the importance of duty. It was not about personal happiness. It was about survival. Meanwhile, the girl had been raised in a household where strength and wisdom were expected of every member. Her parents had taught her to stand firm in her beliefs, to value respect, and to understand that sometimes life demanded sacrifices. When she heard about the proposal, her heart sank. She was proud, independent, and unwilling to be used as a tool for someone else's gain. She had dreams, hopes, and her own sense of purpose, and the thought of marriage to a man she had never met made her feel trapped. Yet her parents insisted, reminding her that sometimes the choices of adults were necessary for the family's survival. The day they were to meet arrived. He had already prepared himself to be polite, distant, and formal. She entered the small, sunlit room with her head held high, her posture confident, yet her eyes revealed the inner storm of emotions she could not let anyone see. For a moment, they simply looked at each other in silence. There were no smiles, no introductions filled with warmth. Only the awareness that this was not a choice either of them wanted. He spoke first, his voice steady but careful. "I understand the arrangement. I will do what I must." She replied, her voice calm but firm, "I did not marry for love, and I will not pretend to feel something I do not. I hope that is understood." He nodded. There was no anger in his expression, only the faint shadow of regret. He had known from the beginning that love would not be part of this. It was a transaction, a necessary step to protect both families. And yet, seeing the determination in her eyes, he felt a strange mix of respect and unease. This was not going to be easy for either of them. The first days in the same household were tense. They shared meals at the same table but spoke only when necessary. She took care of her responsibilities with quiet diligence, careful to keep her distance. He observed, careful not to impose, yet constantly aware of the need to maintain order and respect. Every small interaction was measured, every word chosen with care. The air between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts, yet there was an underlying understanding. Neither would disrespect the other, even if their hearts were not in it. Neighbors and relatives occasionally visited, offering advice, gossip, and their own expectations. Both of them kept their composure, aware that any sign of weakness might be misunderstood. The girl noticed how he treated the farmhands fairly, listened carefully to his neighbors, and never allowed his pride to overshadow the needs of others. She could not deny that, despite the circumstances, he carried himself with a quiet integrity. He noticed how she handled herself, unafraid to speak her mind when needed, careful and thoughtful in her actions, and capable of standing her ground without raising her voice. There was no love yet, but there was recognition, a silent acknowledgement of each other's strength. Evenings were the hardest. They spent time in the same room, sometimes reading, sometimes working, but always apart in thought. He would look over occasionally, catching her reading a book or tending to the small garden she had been given. She would notice his glance, and both would quickly return to their own tasks, careful not to allow emotions to surface that could make the situation more complicated. And yet beneath the surface, small threads of understanding began to form. They were learning each other's rhythms, each other's habits, and the unspoken rules of coexistence. One afternoon, a problem arose with the boundary fences. A neighboring family had mistakenly extended their grazing land onto their property. The girl, refusing to remain silent, spoke up at the community meeting. She explained clearly, with respect, why the land belonged to her family and why it was essential to maintain fairness. The man watched quietly, impressed by her courage and clarity. She had not asked for his approval, but she had earned it. When the meeting concluded, he approached her, not with words of praise, but with a simple nod, a gesture that conveyed more than 1,000 sentences could. She met his eyes and returned the nod, understanding that he had seen her strength and respected it. As weeks passed, they began to cooperate in small ways. Shared responsibilities became opportunities for subtle communication. When it rained and the soil threatened the crops, they worked together without speaking, each observing the other's methods and adapting to them. When the chores were done, there were moments of quiet companionship, sitting side by side, tending to the animals or walking the fence lines. Still, neither tried to force affection. There was no romantic conversation, no declarations of desire. There was only the beginning of a bridge built on mutual understanding and respect. At night, in the quiet of their separate rooms, each reflected on the changes in their life. The man realized that duty alone had brought him here, but there was more to admire than he expected. The girl recognized that while she had resisted the marriage, the man's steady presence, fairness, and lack of cruelty made the arrangement bearable. They were both learning that life was not always about what one wanted, but how one met the challenges before them. By the end of the first month, the tension in the house had softened slightly. There were still disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments of frustration. Yet the unspoken agreement was clear. They would honor their duties, treat each other with respect, and survive this unexpected chapter together. The seeds of something more, understanding, trust, and the faintest hint of companionship, had been planted. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of a bond neither of them had anticipated. The first part of their journey concluded with the realization that life could be difficult and duty could be heavy, but even in arrangements made out of necessity, respect could grow. Both of them went to bed that night with their own thoughts, separate yet intertwined, knowing that the days ahead would test them, challenge them, and perhaps teach them lessons neither had expected. And in that quiet, neither spoke of love, but both understood the quiet power of standing together, even when hearts were not yet joined. Life in the house continued, but it was still not easy. The man, bound by duty and responsibility, continued to focus on managing the ranch, keeping the land, and maintaining the peace with neighboring families. Every day brought challenges that required attention, patience, and careful planning. The Apache girl, now living under the same roof, moved quietly through her tasks, ensuring the home ran smoothly and the small garden she had tended flourished. They shared the same space, yet an invisible line separated them. Neither crossed it, yet both could feel the tension of closeness that was not meant to be. From the very beginning, it was clear that their marriage was practical, not emotional. She had been honest about her feelings, or rather her lack of them, and he had made no promises that did not exist in his heart. He was a man of action, not emotion. To him, love was a luxury that could not interfere with the responsibilities he bore. For her, love was something that could not be forced, and she refused to pretend it existed. Despite this, life together demanded that they interact. The house was small, the chores numerous, and the land needed constant care. Meals were a test of patience. They sat together at the table, passing food in silence. Neither spoke unless necessary. He would ask questions about the garden or the animals, and she would answer with precision and clarity, never adding warmth or small talk. Every conversation was short, factual, and polite. The silence in between was heavy, sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also a space where observation and understanding began to take root. They were learning each other's rhythms without even admitting it. Visitors sometimes came, curious about the arrangement. Neighbors, friends, and family would offer advice, jokes, or remarks that could have been insulting if either had been less patient. The Apache girl noticed how he never reacted with anger. He listened, responded calmly, and never allowed his pride to create conflict. It was not warmth, but it was fairness. She noticed too how he gave her space, never demanding more than she could give, never trying to push her into a role she did not agree to. That small restraint began to build a quiet sense of trust, even if neither wanted to admit it. Work on the ranch was never-ending. The animals needed feeding, fences needed repairs, and the crops required constant attention. Together, they worked, sometimes side by side, sometimes in separate areas, but always aware of each other's presence. The Apache girl admired his diligence, the way he moved with purpose and care, never rushing, never careless. He, in turn, noticed her efficiency, her careful handling of tasks, and the pride she took in maintaining order in the house and garden. Again, this was not affection but acknowledgement. A kind of respect was forming quietly, like a slow-growing plant that needed careful nurturing. Evenings brought another type of challenge. They were alone together in the house, the work done for the day, yet the emotional distance remained. She would sit by the window, reading quietly, while he tended to the ledger, checking accounts and planning for the future. Occasionally, he would glance at her, noticing how focused she was, how carefully she turned the pages of the book, and how calm her expression remained despite the tension in the house. She, too, sometimes noticed him observing her, and though she quickly returned her attention to her reading, there was a strange comfort in being seen without judgment. The first real test of their ability to cooperate came unexpectedly. A sudden storm had damaged part of the fence that separated their land from a neighbor's grazing area. The animals had wandered close to the boundary, and there was a risk they would stray further if the fence was not repaired immediately. They had to work together. He handed her tools and instructions, and though she had never worked a fence before, she followed his guidance carefully. At first, their movements were awkward, their instructions clipped, their voices tight. But as they continued, they found a rhythm. She learned the right way to secure the posts, and he adjusted his method to make it easier for her to follow. By the end of the day, the fence was repaired, and there was a quiet sense of achievement between them. The storm left behind a freshness in the air, a scent of rain and earth that lingered long after the clouds had passed. They cleaned themselves, ate a simple meal, and sat in the dim light of the kitchen. Neither spoke much, yet there was a shared sense of accomplishment. It was the first time they had done something together as partners, not as strangers forced to live in the same house. Though unspoken, there was recognition. When they combined effort, they could succeed in ways neither could alone. Still, the emotional gap remained. She kept reminding herself that she had not married for love. Her heart remained hers, untouched by the arrangements forced upon her. He reminded himself that duty alone had brought him here, and that was enough. Yet, small moments continued to accumulate: shared laughter at an animal's antics, a nod of acknowledgement for work well done, the silent understanding that neither would take advantage of the other. These moments were subtle, almost invisible to an outsider, but to them, they were the foundation of something more meaningful than either had expected. The neighbors were beginning to notice. Some commented on how quietly the house functioned, how the couple seemed to manage their duties efficiently. Rumors circulated, as they always do in small communities, but neither the man nor the girl let the outside opinions affect their conduct. They knew the marriage was theirs to navigate, not anyone else's. And though they had not spoken of feelings, they were learning something more important. Mutual respect could exist even in the absence of love. Days turned into weeks. They shared chores, meals, and responsibilities, and slowly the tension began to lessen. The girl noticed that he would sometimes leave small gestures, extra firewood stacked by the door, a carefully repaired tool left ready for her use. He noticed that she sometimes prepared a little extra food for him, or left notes about how to manage a certain task more efficiently. These were not declarations of affection, but signs of consideration. And with each small gesture, the walls between them began to show cracks, not because of love, but because of shared experience and understanding. One morning, the girl awoke to find him already outside, checking on the livestock. She decided to join him, bringing a basket of fresh bread and water. He looked at her, slightly surprised, but accepted the offerings with a simple, "Thank you." They worked together in silence, feeding animals and repairing minor damage from the previous week's storm. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light across the plains. For the first time, there was no tension in the air, only the steady rhythm of work and quiet companionship. They were still strangers in many ways, but now they were learning how to be partners in practical matters. That evening, as they ate their simple meal, he spoke softly about a decision he had made regarding the land, plans for planting and repairs for the coming season. She listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to understand better. He realized she was intelligent, thoughtful, and capable, not just in domestic tasks but in decisions that affected the ranch. He respected her for that. She, in turn, noticed that he was fair, deliberate, and careful not to overstep boundaries, treating her as an equal rather than a subordinate. Respect was growing silently, almost invisibly between them. Even in moments of disagreement, the tension no longer felt personal. They could correct each other's mistakes without anger, discuss problems without resentment, and plan together without arguments. The marriage had not transformed into love, and neither expected it to. But it had evolved from cold obligation into a relationship built on reliability, competence, and mutual understanding. The house was no longer just a place of duty. It was a space where two people could coexist without conflict, where trust could quietly grow. As night fell, both went to their separate rooms, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a day managed well. The Apache girl thought about the man's steady presence, the way he did not seek to dominate or control, the small gestures of fairness and acknowledgement. The man thought about the girl's calm strength, her ability to handle responsibilities, and her clarity in speech and action. They were not close yet, but the foundation of something deeper than obligation was forming. They were beginning to see each other as capable, reliable, and respectable human beings. By the end of part 2, the story had shifted from the initial tension and cold distance to a fragile understanding. Neither had spoken of love and neither expected to, but they had discovered that living together required more than tolerance. It required attention, care, and respect. They were still strangers, but they were no longer enemies. The days ahead would continue to challenge them, and whether love would ever grow was uncertain. But the first seeds of mutual respect had taken root, quietly and steadily, in the soil of shared responsibility and careful observation. Life on the ranch had settled into a quiet rhythm, but it was far from easy. Days passed with work that never seemed to end, from feeding the animals to repairing fences and planning for the unpredictable seasons. The man continued to approach every task with careful attention, a steady hand, and a strong sense of responsibility. He had learned to manage the ranch alone, but now with the Apache girl in the house, there was a new dimension to his days. They were no longer just his actions and decisions. They had to consider her presence, her opinions, and her abilities. The Apache girl, too, had begun to adjust. She remained firm in her independence and her refusal to give her heart where it was not wanted. But she had discovered that life with the man required more than silent endurance. She had responsibilities to fulfill, work to manage, and now she had to navigate the delicate balance of living with someone whose priorities and ways were very different from hers. She approached each day with care, observing him and adjusting her actions so as not to cause friction, while also ensuring her own voice and sense of self were not lost. One morning, a dispute arose that tested both of them. A neighboring family had encroached on the edge of the ranch again, moving animals closer to the boundary than was acceptable. The man was calm, but inside, he felt a tension he had not allowed himself to feel for weeks. The land was more than property. It was history, legacy, and responsibility. He had to act, but he did not want to confront the neighbors alone. The Apache girl, watching the situation unfold, felt the same tension. She knew that her voice could make a difference. She also knew that for her to remain respected, she could not remain silent. At the community meeting, held under the hot sun in the open yard of the neighboring family, the tension was palpable. The man began to speak, explaining the boundaries and pointing out the agreements that had been made. But when the neighbor interrupted, dismissing his words with a tone of superiority, the girl stepped forward. She spoke clearly, respectfully, but firmly, explaining why the land belonged to their family and why maintaining the boundary was essential for fairness. She did not raise her voice. She did not insult anyone, but the strength and clarity in her words could not be ignored. The man watched her closely. He had always believed that courage was measured in action, but here was someone who demonstrated courage in her voice and presence. She did not rely on his authority or his approval. She stood on her own, demanding respect simply by asserting what was right. He felt a deep, unspoken admiration. At that moment, he understood that her strength was not in obedience or compliance, but in wisdom, clarity, and integrity. For the first time, he saw her not only as a companion forced by circumstance, but as a person of remarkable character. After the meeting, they walked back to the ranch side by side. Neither spoke for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was thoughtful, reflective. Finally, he said quietly, "You handled that well." I did not expect anyone to explain things so clearly. She glanced at him, not smiling but acknowledging the remark. "I had to," she replied simply. "It was the right thing to do, nothing more." He nodded, understanding that she did not seek praise or reward. She acted out of principle, not for recognition, and that impressed him even more. The following days brought small, quiet tests of their growing understanding. Work needed to be done on the fences damaged by the recent storm, and they were forced to collaborate closely. She learned quickly how to manage the repairs efficiently, while he adjusted his methods to guide her without making her feel incompetent. They fell into a rhythm of silent cooperation, communicating without words through gestures, glances, and shared movements. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced a sense of partnership they had never anticipated. Yet pride remained a barrier. Both were stubborn in their ways. She refused to bow to authority she did not respect, and he refused to compromise principles that had guided him all his life. Arguments sometimes arose, not loud or hostile, but firm and resolute. He would insist on the most practical solution to a problem, and she would question whether it respected fairness or culture. Their debates were measured, but charged with emotion, and each stood their ground without yielding. It was exhausting, frustrating, and yet through it all, an unspoken respect continued to grow. One evening, after a particularly long day, they found themselves sitting outside the house, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The quiet of the plain stretched before them, warm and calm. He broke the silence. "I never expected someone to challenge me like you did," he said. "I usually decide and people follow, but you make me think." She looked at him, her expression serious. "Thinking is better than following blindly," she replied. Their words were simple, yet in them lay the beginnings of understanding. They were recognizing each other's intelligence and integrity, which was a stronger bond than either had anticipated. The next challenge came unexpectedly. One morning, an important part of the land had been damaged by an unexpected flood. Crops were ruined, and the animals were distressed. Both of them had to act immediately. The man planned the repair, while she executed critical tasks with precision. They worked together from sunrise to sunset, coordinating without speaking much. When the work was done, the farm was safe, the animals were calm, and the land had been protected. Exhausted, they sat side by side on the porch. Neither spoke, but both understood that they had accomplished something important as a team. For the first time, the partnership felt real. Respect deepened further when an outsider commented on how well they managed the ranch together. The man had always relied on his own strength, and she had always relied on hers. But now, others were recognizing their combined ability. Though they did not seek validation, it was a subtle reminder that even in a marriage forced by duty, cooperation could lead to remarkable results. The Apache girl noticed that he did not allow praise to overshadow her role. He spoke carefully to ensure she received acknowledgement for her contributions. She, in turn, ensured that he was credited for his guidance and decisions. Mutual respect was now visible, not just in private, but in their interactions with the community. As weeks passed, the walls of pride slowly softened. They began to anticipate each other's needs and actions without words. If a tool was missing, it was placed where the other could find it. If a task was overwhelming, help was offered without demand. There was no love yet, but there was consideration, thoughtfulness, and care. They discovered that living together, even in circumstances neither wanted, could create a bond based on equality and fairness. It was an understanding that neither could ignore, no matter how much they resisted emotional closeness. Evenings became moments of reflection. Sitting in the quiet of the house, each would consider the other's strengths and efforts. The Apache girl thought about his dedication, his fairness, and his steady presence, qualities that had initially seemed cold but now appeared reliable. The man thought about her intelligence, her courage, and her ability to handle herself with calm authority, qualities that commanded respect and made him reconsider his assumptions. In this reflection, they began to see each other not as a duty or obligation, but as a person worthy of recognition and admiration. By the end of this part of their journey, the first real bonds of trust and respect had been established. The marriage was still one of duty, and neither had developed love. But through shared challenges, debate, cooperation, and recognition of each other's strength, they had begun to bridge the emotional distance that had seemed so vast at the beginning. They were no longer strangers forced together by circumstance. They were two people learning to navigate life as partners in practical and meaningful ways. The story of their lives was slowly shifting. The initial tension and cold distance had given way to cautious collaboration and mutual recognition. Pride still remained, and love had not appeared but respect, the kind that forms quietly through observation, shared struggle, and acknowledgement, was growing steadily. They were learning a valuable lesson, that sometimes, even in arrangements made out of necessity, something meaningful could emerge, not in the heart but in understanding and regard. And as the sun set over the plains, painting the sky with colors of gold and pink, both of them sat quietly, side by side, knowing that life together, no matter how unexpected or unwanted at first, had the power to teach patience, fairness, and respect. They were still on a journey, and the days ahead would bring more challenges, tests of character, and opportunities for connection. But for the first time, neither felt entirely alone in the house. They had begun to see the person next to them not as a stranger or obligation, but as someone whose strength and integrity mattered, and that was the first step toward something more enduring. The days that followed the storm and the disputes over the land brought a new sense of routine for the man and the Apache girl. The tension that had once filled the house had softened, though not entirely disappeared. It was replaced by a quiet, almost imperceptible understanding. They still did not speak of love, and neither expected it, but their shared responsibilities and challenges were slowly teaching them how to rely on one another. They had begun to see each other not just as strangers or obligations, but as capable and trustworthy partners. The work on the ranch was never easy. There were always animals to care for, fences to repair, and the land to maintain. But now, instead of silently tolerating one another, they began to communicate more effectively. He started to notice the small ways she contributed, the careful attention she gave to the garden, the way she noticed the subtle signs of illness in the animals, and the meticulous way she managed supplies. He began to ask for her advice more often, seeking her insight on practical matters, and she gave her guidance clearly, without pride or condescension. One afternoon, they faced a significant challenge. A portion of the fence on the southern boundary had weakened, threatening to allow the cattle to stray into neighboring land. The man had begun the repair work alone, but the Apache girl offered to help. At first he hesitated, unused to receiving assistance, but then he realized that working together would be faster and more effective. Side by side, they lifted posts, hammered nails, and measured distances. They communicated with short, precise instructions, their movements gradually falling into an unspoken rhythm. During the repair, they began to notice small details about one another. He observed how she handled the heavy posts with careful strength, never rushing, always making sure each one was secure. She noticed his patience and methodical approach, the way he double-checked measurements and corrected mistakes quietly rather than criticizing. Their admiration for each other's skills grew silently, forming the foundation of a trust that neither had expected to develop. That evening, after the work was done, they shared a quiet meal. Neither spoke of feelings, but there was a subtle warmth in the way they interacted. He passed her the water jug without being asked. She prepared a little extra bread for him, noticing that he had skipped lunch while tending the fence. It was not love or romance, but it was care, a recognition that they were no longer just individuals acting alone, but two people whose actions affected each other. Over the following weeks, their cooperation deepened. They began to anticipate each other's needs. If a tool was missing, it was placed where the other could easily find it. If a task seemed too large to handle alone, help was offered without a word. They developed a silent understanding, a rhythm of life that relied on trust and observation rather than spoken requests. Each day brought small successes that reinforced their partnership. They were learning that living together did not have to mean conflict, and that respect could exist even where love did not. The Apache girl, for her part, began to notice a change in herself. She had entered the marriage expecting only duty, obligation, and perhaps resentment. But through daily life, she realized that she was capable of cooperation and compromise without losing herself. She could express her opinions, make her voice heard, and still maintain her dignity. She could work with the man without surrendering her independence. These small victories gave her a quiet confidence that she had not anticipated. The man, too, was learning lessons he had never expected. He had always valued duty, discipline, and practicality above all else, believing that emotions were a distraction. But through observing the girl, he saw that strength could come in many forms: calm wisdom, careful observation, and unwavering principles. He began to recognize that partnership was not about authority or control, but about mutual support. And though he would never admit it aloud, he found that he valued her perspective and her presence more than he had anticipated. One morning, an unexpected challenge tested them further. A sudden heat wave threatened the crops, and the water supply needed careful management. They worked side by side, rationing water for the garden, ensuring the animals had enough, and improvising a plan to protect the most vulnerable plants. It was hard work, and sweat dripped from their brows, but they found satisfaction in their cooperation. They moved seamlessly, anticipating each other's actions without speaking, their trust growing in the shared burden of responsibility. During this period, they also learned to communicate more effectively. Discussions that might have turned into arguments in the past were now handled calmly and respectfully. He would explain his reasoning, and she would respond with clear suggestions or concerns. Neither interrupted, neither dismissed the other's ideas. They were beginning to see the value in each other's perspective, and slowly, the walls of pride and stubbornness began to soften. They were discovering that cooperation could be fulfilling in a way that neither had expected, even if it did not involve love. One evening, after a long day managing both the ranch and the challenges of the heat wave, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains. The sky was a mixture of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the land. For a moment, the house was silent, except for the distant sounds of the animals and the wind rustling through the trees. He broke the silence, not with words of romance, but with a quiet observation. "I never realized how much work it takes to keep everything running smoothly," he said. She nodded, not looking at him, but in her tone was acknowledgement. "It takes patience," she replied, "and respect for what needs to be done." That simple exchange captured the essence of their growing understanding. They were not speaking of feelings or emotions, but of the reality of life and work, and how they could face it together. They had begun to recognize the importance of each other's contributions, the value of cooperation, and the power of shared responsibility. These lessons were slowly reshaping their relationship, moving it from one of obligation to one of mutual respect and practical partnership. Small gestures continued to reinforce this connection. He began leaving tools and supplies in places she could easily reach. She started preparing tasks in ways that anticipated his needs. They began to understand the unspoken language of daily life, the rhythm of working together, and the satisfaction that came from achieving goals side by side. It was a quiet form of intimacy, one that did not require declarations of love, but depended on trust, competence, and respect. The community began to notice the change as well. The house that had once seemed tense and cold now radiated a sense of calm and order. Neighbors commented on how well the couple managed the ranch and how smoothly their household operated. Both the man and the Apache girl paid little attention to gossip, but the recognition reinforced the value of their cooperation. It was a subtle reminder that even in arrangements made out of necessity, respect and competence could earn admiration from others. As the weeks turned into months, their partnership became stronger. They still maintained their independence and personal boundaries, but they had learned to rely on each other in practical ways. They shared responsibilities, coordinated efforts, and found satisfaction in achieving goals together. While love had not entered the picture, trust and respect had grown steadily, forming a bond that neither could ignore. By the end of this period, both the man and the Apache girl had changed. The man had learned that strength was not only about control or authority, but about recognizing and valuing the abilities of others. The girl had learned that cooperation did not mean surrendering her independence, but that mutual support could create a more manageable and fulfilling life. Together, they had discovered that even in a marriage born of duty and necessity, respect, trust, and understanding could flourish. The chapter of their life that Part 4 captures is one of growth, patience, and learning. They had faced storms, disputes, and the challenges of daily work. And through it all, they had begun to see each other as equals, capable partners, and people worthy of respect. Love was not yet part of the story, and perhaps it never would be, but they had discovered something equally important: the power of understanding, trust, and shared effort. As night fell, they went to their separate rooms, carrying with them the satisfaction of a day managed well. The Apache girl thought about how far she had come, learning to navigate life with someone she had once seen as an obligation. The man reflected on how much he had grown, learning to respect and rely on someone whose skills and judgment he had initially underestimated. They were still not close in the emotional sense, but the distance between them had narrowed. And so, Part 4 closes with the quiet acknowledgement that life together, even when forced, can teach valuable lessons. Through shared burdens, cooperation, and small acts of care, the man and the Apache girl had begun to build a foundation of respect and trust. It was a slow, careful process, but it had taken root, preparing them for the next stage of their journey. Understanding each other on a deeper level, facing external challenges, and discovering the full extent of the bond that had begun quietly in the fields, the house, and the shared work of the ranch. Time had passed since the marriage had first begun, and the house that once felt cold and tense now carried a quiet warmth, not of love, but of understanding. The man and the Apache girl had lived together through seasons of hard work, storms, and challenges, and in that time, a strong foundation of respect had grown between them. They had faced arguments, disagreements, and the burdens of daily life, yet they had never allowed their pride to break the trust that had quietly formed. By now, they had learned to rely on each other without needing to ask. When a tool was misplaced, it would already be placed where it was needed. When a task seemed too large, help was quietly offered without words. Their cooperation had become seamless, almost instinctive. It was not love that bound them, but something just as strong: respect, trust, and the knowledge that each could depend on the other in any circumstance. One morning, they woke to find that a part of the irrigation system had failed overnight. The water supply to the crops was compromised, and without action, a large portion of the harvest could be lost. The man immediately began examining the pipes, while the Apache girl gathered tools and materials. They worked in silence, their movements coordinated without instruction. He noticed how she handled the repairs with care and precision, while she observed his methodical approach, learning from his techniques. The work was demanding, but together they found a rhythm that allowed them to complete it efficiently. After the repair, they stood back and looked at the land. The crops were safe, the irrigation system restored, and the animals unharmed. Neither spoke immediately, but the sense of accomplishment hung between them. For the first time, they both felt a quiet pride in what they could achieve together. The day's work had not only preserved their livelihood, but also strengthened the bond of mutual reliance that had quietly grown over the months. Life continued to challenge them in ways they had not anticipated. Neighbors sometimes tested the boundaries of the land. Unexpected weather events demanded careful planning, and the demands of the ranch never ceased. Through each challenge, they learned to communicate without conflict. Their conversations were focused, respectful, and efficient. They began to understand each other's reasoning and methods, anticipating concerns before they were voiced. It was a subtle intimacy, built on shared effort, observation, and mutual respect. The Apache girl noticed that the man had begun to trust her judgment. He sought her input on decisions about the land and the animals, and he accepted her advice without question. This was not because he was obligated to, but because he had seen the wisdom in her actions and respected her skill. Similarly, he noticed that she, once so firm in her independence, now allowed him to guide certain decisions, not out of submission, but because she recognized the practicality of his experience. Their cooperation had evolved into a partnership built on equality, not power or obligation. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The air was calm, filled only with the gentle sounds of animals settling for the night and the wind moving through the trees. He spoke softly, his voice thoughtful, not demanding or instructing. "I never thought we could manage all this together so well," he said. She looked at him and nodded. "It took time," she replied. "We had to learn how to work as a team without getting in each other's way." There was a pause, a shared silence, and in that moment they both felt a deep understanding of each other's strength and character. As the days passed, their interactions became warmer, though still cautious. Small gestures of care began to appear more naturally. He would leave a warm drink for her when she returned from working in the fields, and she would make sure the kitchen was ready for him when he returned from inspecting the land. These gestures were subtle, almost unnoticed by anyone else, but they carried meaning. They reflected attention, consideration, and the growing bond of trust between them. One day, a challenge arose that tested their partnership in a new way. A sudden storm had threatened to flood part of the land. They had to act quickly to secure equipment, protect crops, and safeguard the animals. Working together, they coordinated tasks efficiently, each anticipating the other's moves. In the midst of the chaos, they moved without words, relying on the trust and understanding they had built. By the end of the day, the damage was minimal, and they had successfully protected the ranch. This event reinforced their reliance on one another, showing that their bond was not just convenience. It was a real partnership forged in action and shared responsibility. Through these experiences, the Apache girl began to reflect on how far she had come. She had entered the marriage with resistance, expecting only duty and obligation. But now, she recognized that she had found someone she could rely on, someone who respected her decisions and strength. Her feelings had shifted subtly. Though love was not part of their relationship, she felt a sense of security, fairness, and trust that was rare in life. She could appreciate the man not for romance, but for the integrity and reliability he consistently displayed. The man, too, noticed the changes within himself. He had always valued duty, discipline, and independence, believing that emotions were distractions. But over time, he had come to recognize the girl's wisdom, courage, and practical intelligence. Her presence had taught him patience, observation, and the importance of listening. He admired her not for affection, but for her strength of character and her ability to act with clarity and fairness. The respect he felt for her had grown into something steady, reliable, and deeply meaningful. Their relationship, though not romantic, had become one of profound partnership. They trusted each other in ways neither had anticipated, and they relied on each other without hesitation. Decisions about the land, animals, and household were shared, and disagreements were resolved calmly and respectfully. Pride and stubbornness still existed, but they no longer prevented cooperation or understanding. Together, they had built a life that functioned smoothly, effectively, and fairly. The community began to notice the harmony between them. Friends and neighbors remarked on how well they managed the ranch and the household. They saw two people who, though married out of necessity, had learned to work together, respect each other's skills, and maintain a sense of fairness in all their actions. Though the couple did not speak of love, their partnership became an example of how trust, cooperation, and respect could form a strong bond, even in the absence of romance. As the seasons changed, their bond continued to deepen. Winter brought new challenges, harsh winds, frozen pipes, and heavy snow that required careful management. Through it all, they faced each obstacle together, coordinating efforts and supporting each other. These shared struggles reinforced their reliance on one another and strengthened the quiet respect that had grown over the months. They were no longer two individuals forced into a situation. They had become true partners, capable of facing life's difficulties together. One evening, after a long day of ensuring the ranch was prepared for the winter, they sat by the fire in the small house. The room was warm, filled with the gentle crackle of burning wood. He looked at her quietly and said, "I did not expect this. I did not think we could find understanding in all of this." She met his gaze, calm and steady. "We did what we had to do," she replied. "And in doing it, we learned how to work together." There was no declaration of love, no romantic words, but there was mutual acknowledgement, a recognition that their journey together had created something meaningful and rare. By the end of Part 5, their story had reached a natural conclusion. They had not found romantic love, nor had they ever expected to. Instead, they had discovered something equally important, a partnership built on trust, fairness, and respect. Through shared challenges, cooperation, and quiet gestures of consideration, they had learned to rely on each other, value each other's strengths, and navigate life as equals. The marriage that had begun as an arrangement born of duty had transformed into a true partnership, demonstrating that respect and understanding could thrive even where love was not present. And as they looked out over the land they had preserved and maintained together, the man and the Apache girl understood that their lives had changed in a profound way. They were no longer strangers forced into a marriage. They were partners who had faced hardship, learned patience, and built a bond that would endure. Respect had grown where resentment had once been, trust had replaced distance, and cooperation had turned obligation into something meaningful. They had discovered that sometimes, even when love is absent, life can offer something just as powerful: understanding, reliability, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that together they could face anything,